Welcome to Saltwater Aquarium Radio, the podcast that brings you saltwater aquarium information, tips, and stories to help you become more successful with your own salty venture. Now here's your host, Jeff Hesketh.
What's going on, guys? A brand new episode of the Saltwater Aquarium Radio podcast. And today, what we're going to be doing is talking with Mr. Keith Berkelhammer. He is the man behind Reefbum, and we're going to talk to him about his setups that he's had over the years, as well as his love for keeping it simple. So let's jump into episode number 30. What's going on, guys? We're back at it again. Saltwater Aquarium Radio Podcast, episode number 30. That's right, episode number 30. And we have a brand new one for you. Today we're going to be talking with Mr. Keith Berkelhammer, and he's a guy behind Reefbum. And he has some of the best articles out there. If you are unfamiliar with reefbum.com, I strongly recommend that you check it out. After this podcast, he puts together some amazing content, and he has a very interesting approach. He is on YouTube, but he does a 24/7 live stream. His tank is available for you to see 24/7. Now, I definitely couldn't have my tank available for everybody to see 24/7 because you might be a little bit disappointed in me. Sometimes I just don't clean the glass. I'm sorry. But anyways, Keith is a guy that knows his stuff. He's been in the hobby for a really long time, and he definitely knows what he's talking about. So let's jump into my interview with Keith from Reefbum. Keith, welcome to the podcast. Why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Jeff, thanks for having me, man. I appreciate it. Geez, I've been in the reef aquarium hobby for over 25 years. I guess I'm one of the old timers. I don't know if you want to call myself an old timer, but yeah, you know, I've been in the hobby for a very long time, and I started off. Really, my father got me into the whole fish tank scene when I was a kid. He kept fish only saltwater tanks, and I remember he had a 125-gallon saltwater tank, and that's kind of like, I guess, how the seed got planted for me, was growing up and being around saltwater fish tanks and going to the fish store with him, and you know, being there when he was picking up fish and what have you. So I don't know, I always kind of had the bug in me, and then when I got out of college and got a job, I started to dabble a little bit and started off with a 2-gallon little freshwater tank that I'd set up for a little goldfish that I won in a street fair to house a little goldfish. I kind of felt sorry for it. I wanted, you know, one of those ping pong ball type of contests where you throw a ping pong ball into little goldfish bowls, and the ping pong ball landed in one of the bowls, so I had to find a home for this goldfish. Anyway, that 2-gallon tank turned into, like, I don't know, a 20-gallon freshwater tank, and ended up turning into it was a 29-gallon planted freshwater tank. So I was started to kind of like get into the whole keeping a live ecosystem with the freshwater and growing live plants. So maybe that was kind of the foundation in terms of getting into growing corals. Anyway, that turned into a 90-gallon saltwater reef tank. That was my first reef tank, and I was living in New York City at the time, so that was interesting to have a reef tank in New York City. And my wife and I eventually moved out of the city into the suburbs of New York, and at that point, I think the tank I had was about 120 gallon in-wall reef tank in a house. So I had, went from an apartment to a house and had a lot more room to, have all the equipment, and that was an in-wall tank. So that was an interesting setup. But I had our builder create a closet really behind the tank, so it was nice to have a lot of space, and so that tank was great. And then we ended up moving to another house in Connecticut. I think that was about 8 years later, and that's where I set up my biggest tank ever, which was a 225 gallon saltwater reef tank, and that thing was that was a great tank. I think I had that set up for about 5 years, and I was fortunate to be able to have the plumbing go through the floor down into the basement. So I had all the sump and the equipment set up in the basement in that house, and I had a couple of return pumps that would essentially recirculate the water back up through the basement to the fish tank. So it really had no equipment upstairs other than the lights and the ballast for the lights, and I had a whole unfinished basement that I was able to kind of have all my equipment spread out in, and back then I had a 50-inch tall Venturi skimmer. It was like a skyscraper, but it was just a great skimmer, and it really did the job. But that was an SPS dominant tank, so I just really it just grew corals like weeds in that tank. I had 400-watt metal halide lining, with that skimmer. I had that sump. What else? I used activated carbon and GFO and a calcium reactor. So it was a pretty simple system, but it did a great job. And then, eventually and I ran into some issue. I think the big issue with that tank was the corals were growing so much that it started to just kind of choke each other out, and I didn't really have, I guess, planned enough space for the corals to really grow out, and so the circulation started getting cut off and slowly started to go downhill. In that tank, I also had aqua-eating flatworms. I think back then, aqua-eating flatworms were certainly becoming an issue, and I don't think hobbyists like myself were as diligent as we are today in terms of trying to keep pests out of the reef tanks. But I had the aqua-eating flatworms, but I did this, basically I basted my tank every week with a turkey baster to blow off the aqua-eating flatworms, and I had a whole bunch of wrasses in that tank. So I think I was able to manage that issue by just doing the basting and having the wrasses kind of like eat up the aqua-eating flatworms. So, I started losing a couple colonies here and there, but really that tank still thrived even with that issue. But eventually I did break that tank down, and we moved up to Vermont. So I think it was 2 or 3 years I did not have a reef tank. And when I moved up to Vermont, I knew I wanted to set up another tank. I think it's a disease that we all have, right? In this reef tank hobby is you can never really get it out of your system. So it was something that, I knew eventually I would set up another tank again. And the tank that I do currently have set up here in Vermont is a 187 gallon tank. So it's slightly smaller than that 225 gallon tank. It's 5 foot long and 30 inches wide and 24 inches tall. And this tank is set up in my basement here in Vermont. And what I did was I set up a sump room in the room next door in the basement. I got a finished basement here, but then the unfinished part, I have all my my equipment in the sump. So I did all the plumbing through the wall, and it's just gravity fed into the sump. And then I got a couple of return pumps that pump back into the tank. So again, this is kind of a similar setup where I pretty much don't have any equipment underneath the tank stand. I just have some light ballast behind the tank, and I like it that way. I always say that if you can pull that off and have a remote sump, then that's something that is a great thing to have with a reef tank, because as you probably know, Jeff, there's a lot of equipment that you can accumulate. But I think that really keeping a system simple as possible has always been something that's been something that I've strived for, and I think it's been part of my success in terms of being able to just have a minimal amount of equipment. I think the more variables that you have in play, the more moving parts, the higher the chances are that something will go wrong with the tank. So with this tank, I haven't changed a lot. I mean, I've changed some things in terms of what I've done in the past. With this tank, I started this tank, this 187-gallon Reef Tank, back in June of 2015. And for the first time ever, I started a Reef Tank with dry rock only and live sand. But I just had one problem after another. I had some bacterial bloom, I had some diatoms, and then dinoflagellates, which just was a pest that I had never had before in my whole Reef Tank, career. And it was just, it was quite a foe. And I did a lot of different things. I did, peroxide dosing. I did a couple of different times. I did some 3-day blackouts. What else did I do? I did a number of things to try to combat that pest, and my corals just really took a beating, and it was something where I just, I know folks have had success in terms of dirtying up a tank when they have the dinos and increasing nitrates and phosphates and getting more biodiversity in the tank. But I had some great success in the past using live rock for my Reef Tanks that I knew that, I wanted to kind of take a step back and reboot this tank. So what I decided to do was just break it down completely, sell everything in terms of, the rock I had in there. Actually, I didn't even sell that rock. I think I just threw it out. It was something I think I just tossed into the dump or whatnot. But I got rid of all the livestock in the tank, and I just kept the tank dry for a few weeks and decided to restart it. So what I wanted to do was go on a quest to find live rock, and that's not as easy today as it was in the past. Before, 20 years ago, what have you, there was many places, local fish stores, LFS, where you can go and pick up some live rock to start a Reef Tank. But I live in Vermont. We don't have a lot of those places around, and actually, I know from where I used to live in New York and Connecticut that there's not a lot of live rock to be found at these fish stores. So I really did a lot of research on the topic, and what I learned was a lot of folks that had success using Haitian live rock, but the issue with that is trying to get it to where I'm at here in the Northeast, and that's obviously a challenge, because if you want to ship live rock, especially wet, to avoid die-off, that can be very expensive in terms of the overnight or at least a couple of day, freight costs. The longer it takes in terms of shipment, the more possibility is that you're going to lose all the good stuff in the live rock, the biodiversity, the bacteria, and all that stuff. That stuff's going to perish. So I actually was able to pick some up in Florida. I was on vacation in Florida, around the Orlando area, and I found a local fish store down there that actually, I guess, had a big supply of Haitian live rock. So that's where I picked it up, and I took the live rock back with me on the plane back to Vermont, and got it back into the house here, and so I restarted the tank with that Haitian live rock. And one of the other things I did with this tank is instead of using GFO, I ended up using a Paxpellum arid algae reactor as my main source of nutrient export. So that was something I did differently with this tank in terms of the reboot. The other thing I did differently was, in the past I always had been using calcium reactors, but I decided I wanted to do two-part. I'd used two-part before in the past, but really kind of the beginning of my reef keeping career, and then I switched over to a calcium reactor and had a lot of success with a calcium reactor. But the one disadvantage with a calcium reactor is that it can lower the pH. I have used calc reactors in the past to counterbalance the lower pH. But what I do like about the two-part is that there's more precision in terms of dosing the calcium and the alkaline, and you can really dial in that DKH that you're looking for, and it's not as easy with a calcium reactor. So that was the other thing that was different in terms of restarting this tank. I am still using metal halide lighting. I feel like I'm probably one of the few out there that is still using metal halide lighting. I use 400 watt radium 20K bulbs, running those on HQI ballasts, and I don't know, the last so I restarted this tank about a year and a half ago. The first 8 months or so I was not growing corals. In fact, I was losing LPS. I was losing some frags. Stuff was not growing. It was a bit of a mystery, and I did have very low phosphate, so I think that was part of the problem. But what I also discovered is that I had a rusty magnet on my frag rack in the tank that I didn't realize was rusting until I really kind of looked very closely at it. So it was either maybe it was a combination of those two things, very, very low phosphates and some maybe heavy metal in the water. Even though I did an ICP test, I didn't see any heavy metal. But anyway, at pretty much the beginning of this year, in January, I did some massive water changes. I did switch salts, and things turned around. And past 10 months or so, I've just been really growing a lot of coral, and the tank has been doing great. And knock on wood, hopefully it's on the right path.
I actually touched on this on the last podcast. I answered a question from a subscriber, and it was a very loaded question. It touched on a bunch of different things, and one of those was live rock versus dry rock. And even though currently my system, I did start that with dry rock, I have heard from some very knowledgeable people as of late how they've had nothing but troubles with having tanks that have started with dry rock and have seen dramatic increases when they switched over to live rock. And that your story right there just kind of reaffirms that for me.
Yeah, no, I know a couple of other hobbyists, veteran hobbyists that have run into, that have run into that same issue. So, and I think biodiversity is very important when starting a reef tank, and I think you're probably looking at a year and a half to 2 years before you can really have a tank that started with dry rock only that's really going to be able to support a thriving reef tank with SPS. It just seems like you got to really jumpstart that biological bed with some very rich live rock.
So I'm currently looking at your reef tank right now via live stream on YouTube, and it looks like you have quite a bit of SPS on the top portion of your rock work, and then it kind of works down into LPS. It looks like some polyps to the right-hand side.
Yep.
So is all of that rock that you have there, is that all Haitian live rock?
Yeah, that's all Haitian live rock. And on my website, reefbum.com, there's actually I've got a series of photos when I first started the tank. There's a picture of the tank with just the bare aquascape, so you can kind of just see the rock without any corals on it. And then so I've got some progression shots. And if you looked at on the website too, there's a series of progression shots that I have from my old 225-gallon tank, and I did the same thing. I've got a picture of the tank without any corals in it, with just the aquascape, with the live rock, and that was Tonga live rock, which I don't even think you can get that stuff anymore, or it's very hard to get. And then over time you could just see the corals growing, and you cannot see the rock. I guess after a couple of years of SPF. So that's my hope, Jeff, with this tank. We won't even be able to see that rock in about another year or so.
So how do you feel that your methodology of reef keeping has changed over the years?
Well, let me put it this way. I think reef keeping has actually gotten harder than it was when I got into it. And I think the big reason for that is because the equipment is a lot better than it was when I first started. So the equipment is a lot more efficient. And what I mean by that is like the skimmers that are, we got today are just really so good at pulling out nutrients from the tank. So I think the technology has gotten so good that the tanks have gotten really, too clean. And so that's something that I don't really remember having to deal with before in the past, is that, a tank that, with the equipment on it, whether it's a protein skimmer or something else, or algae reactor, they do a really, really good job in terms of what they're supposed to be doing. But I think that also kind of goes against what we're trying to do with a reef tank in terms of trying to support a live ecosystem. So, I mean, in terms of what I've done, the constants that I've tried to keep in terms of my beliefs is that you got to be diligent and do the maintenance on a tank. You've got to be very patient. You've got to keep the hands out of the tank. Those are things that I try to do today that I really was, doing when I had a lot of success with my tanks in the past. So I think those are principles that I try to stick with in the sense of, patience and keeping up with the maintenance, and trying not to fiddle with things. I think those are key things. I haven't bought any new corals since, I think it was June. And I'm just trying to keep my hands out of the tank and let Mother Nature do her thing and let the corals grow, and not try to be obsessive about, that coral doesn't look like right in that spot, and I'm going to move it because I think that's there's a better spot for it or something like that. I think that's, when you're touching corals and you're moving things around, you're stressing them out, and things are not going to grow as fast. If you just leave things alone, they'll, they can blossom. And, I've had a number of times when I had some frags that just look like, really like nothing special, just very bland looking SPS frags. And I just left them alone, and they blossomed in these beautiful corals. So I think for me, it's always about having that patience and just trying to not mess with things and tinker.
So as far as, you've touched on this a little bit already, but as far as your filtration system, the water leaves your tank, then it goes into your sump. What kind of equipment do you have in your sump that is working for your aquarium and keeping it where it needs to be?
It's a pretty simple system. It's, I've got a series of, 10 filter sucks. So different micron sizes so that's mechanical filtration. So that's the first part of the sump is, I've got 8 different filter sucks. It's one of those oil exclusive dream boxes. Then I got a skimmer in there, and I've got a media reactor with activated carbon. So I run that, and I've got a algae reactor, and that's what I'm using for nutrient export. So I'm growing Cato in that thing, and that's helping me manage my phosphates and my nitrates. I dose 2-part, so I'm dosing calcium and I'm dosing alkalinity. I'm dosing nitrates and phosphates because of the algae reactor. They're pulling out a lot of nitrates and phosphates. So I find it that's something you have to do with an algae reactor in terms of dosing nitrates. With the phosphates, what I like to do is get to the point where I know the algae reactor is kind of zeroing out the phosphates, and I think it's easier to control the phosphate level by dosing, at least for my tank. I find it easier. And that's pretty much it. I also have a GHL pH director, so I'm monitoring alkalinity on a daily basis. That's something that is relatively new in my system. It's a great thing. I think alkalinity is probably one of the most important parameters you can monitor for a reef tank. So to be able to look at that on a daily basis and course correct along the way, depending on what I see, is, I think, a huge thing. And I know a lot of folks out there in the hobby are starting to use those.
I've been battling this for a couple of days now. I've been thinking about removing this piece of equipment, and you didn't talk about this piece of equipment. I'm wondering what your thoughts would be on it. What do you think about carbon dosing and things like biopellets?
Yeah, I've never used those, and you're using those for controlling nitrates. Is that what you're using them for?
Yep.
Yeah. I've always just used protein skimmer and done regular water changes when I did not have an algae reactor. I had GFO and I had the protein skimmer, and I did some pretty sizable water changes every week, like 10% water changes every week. And I kind of I still do that with my tank. Today I do regular 10% water changes, and I use the algae reactor for nutrient export. But I never did end up using biopellets, to control nitrates. So, I think it all depends in terms of what's going on with your system. If you're if it's something where it's too clean and the biopellets are causing the nitrates to be too low, then that's one thing. And I guess if the opposite is going on, then that's another thing. But I don't have a lot to draw on in terms of the biopellets.
Yeah, I think I don't know how I feel about them right now. I've been using them for quite a long time. My nitrates are running around 3 parts per million, 5 parts per million, and that's pretty low. Mm-hmm. Pretty low for a reef tank. And I hear a lot of people that have very successful reef tanks often say, they're 10, 15, even 20. I just feel, because I've had trouble with keeping SPS corals, and I'm starting to think that it may be the biopellets to blame.
Yeah, I mean, what else are you using? What are you using to control phosphates?
Outside of that, really, it's biopellets, protein skimming, and that's about it. Water changes. Yeah, I mean, my nitrates are about 2.5 parts per million right now. They were actually even lower, and my phosphates were. My phosphates are in the 0.03 to 0.08 range. It just depends, but they vary. I think I've had success with my tanks with nitrates in the 2.5 to 5 part per million range, and I know folks have run nitrates a lot higher and have had great tanks. So it depends on the system, and it depends on how the corals are reacting to that. But, obviously you don't want to have a system that's too stripped of nutrients, because that's not a good thing. But, I do dose a lot of nitrates to keep my nitrates, at that lower level. But, I think you also have to be, depends on the age of the system. How old is your tank? It's approaching the 2-year mark, but I again started with dry rock. So
dry rock.
Yeah.
You could. Yeah. Well, maybe you're probably hitting that point now where maybe you'll kind of turn the corner.
I am starting to see sponges. I got lucky because at one point I was actually going to the local fish store and buying sponges and adding them to the aquarium. But I'm starting to see sponge growth within the live rock. But as far as corals go, I think it was about this time last year, I had rapid tissue necrosis run through the tank with my SPS corals, and it was pretty devastating.
Yeah, what, you have like an alk swing or something?
No, everything was in line. I was testing daily,
really?
Not daily, weekly, and everything was right where it needed to be. That what was it? I usually keep it around 8.2, 8.3 on my alk.
Uh-huh.
And
yep,
I did this past summer have a issue with high calcium and low alkalinity, but I worked through that, and I'm finally back where I needed to be with that. But ultimately, I just kind of feel that I don't know if it's the biopellets, but I kind of want to take it offline for a while and see if that makes a difference.
Yeah. Have you ever had any algae issues?
A little bit here and there. And I've tried a low end kind of do it yourself algae reactor. But I saw really good growth in it for a period of time. Then I don't know if I wasn't diligent enough with it or what, but it kind of just eventually worked its way out.
Yeah, no, algae reactors, it's definitely a learning curve in terms of, you got to dose some iron, you got to dose some nitrates, and, you got to keep on top of that stuff. So the chaeto can be a little tricky. Usually, the recommendation is to try to keep nitrates at 101 ratio to the phosphates to maximize the chaeto growth.
Does that help with coral coloration too, do you think?
I think stable, alk. I think, if you got a DKH in the, in the 8 to 9 range, good lighting, good circulation. I've definitely seen better colors when I've gotten, some nitrates and phosphates present.
So that I'm looking at your live stream right now.
For sure.
Is that a staghorn, that purple one that's kind of it's just from
to the left?
To the right.
The Cali Tort.
Is that what that is?
The right center.
Yeah, it's pretty thick stalk, but it's kind of trying to shoot up a little bit. That's pretty amazing coral.
Yeah, that's one of my favorites. The other coral that I have that's kind of probably hard to see in the live stream is my Oregon blue tort. That's I don't know if you see the kind of on the left side, kind of left center. It's the biggest. Kind of like a yellowish type of branching coral. Probably one of the bigger corals that I got. The Oregon blue tort's like right below that. That's an Aqua SD rainbow millie, that bigger coral. That's like a super fast grower.
Am I seeing polyps?
Yeah.
Am I seeing polyps moving?
Yeah.
That's polyps. Yeah. That's awesome.
And all the LPS I got in this tank, I've never really had this good a success with alveopora and gonoporia, and I don't even feed these things anything. I'm just feeding the fish 3 days a week, some frozen food, and I'm not target feeding these LPS at all. So they're really doing well, and they're getting to a point where they're kind of actually growing over some of the SPS. So I might have to move some things around, or I have a frag tank that's plumbed into this system, and I haven't fired up the lights yet on this thing, but I'm gonna have to start fragging some stuff at some point. It's a good problem to have,
Let me know when you do. I definitely would like to get some coral off you.
Yeah.
Yeah, your LPS corals are looking pretty meaty right now. Is that a scolie on the bottom right-hand corner?
Oh, that's a big meat coral. You're looking at the red one?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of those. What's the scientific name on that thing? Yeah, it's like a meat coral. Yeah, that's a great coral. Yeah, I don't even feed these things, and they're doing really well. But I feed the Larry's Reef Frenzy stuff, and so when I feed, I kind of feed pretty heavily. So there's a lot of small particles that get into the water column that I think just kind of get moved around, and I'm assuming that's how these LPS are getting fed.
One thing I noticed when I'm looking at your tank, you don't have coralline algae out of control. Mine's like, I was looking at it today, and I was like, man, I got to get in there with a razor or something to scrape that off. Like, having that back wall black really makes those corals pop.
Yeah, and that's something I've done my whole, the whole time I've ever kept reef tanks is I keep that back wall pretty much every couple of weeks. I'll go in there and scrape and just keep it clean. But I think that's a really important thing for me, at least, is to have the black background to really have the corals pop. Because when you get the coralline growing, it's just things seem to like blend in more, and it's just not, I think, as dramatic as when you have a solid black background color for the corals to grow, against. So yeah, it's something that it is kind of a pain in the butt to do, but I do try to stay on top of that coralline.
What do you run for lights?
I have 400 watt metal halide radium bulbs. So I've got these two Geisman Spectra fixtures. They're two 24-inch fixtures that I run over the tank, and I've got a couple of switchable HQI ballast, and so the bulbs are overdriven a little bit. But I've stuck with the metal halide lighting, and I've been using those bulbs for a very long time, and I think I would certainly switch to LEDs, but it is an investment in money to do that. So at this point in time, I don't have a lot of motivation to make that investment in the LEDs. I'm sure I can grow corals. I've seen a lot of guys, tanks with LEDs, and they look like they're great at growing stuff, in terms of SPS and LPS, and I guess you'd call me old school. I'm just sticking kind of with the metal halide lighting, but I think eventually I will end up using LEDs in some capacity, maybe on the frag tank.
And there's no supplemental lighting at all. That's just 100% metal halide.
I've got T5s on those fixtures, but I only run them an hour before the halides go on and like an hour after the halides go on. So I am not running the T5s in conjunction with the halides. I'm just running the halides for, what am I running, from like 1 o'clock to 9 o'clock. So like 8 hours each day.
Before we kind of jump off here, I got one more question I'd like to ask you. And for somebody that's starting out in the hobby, what do you think is the most important thing for them to know?
I mentioned this before. It's patience. It's being patient, and not obsessing over things that are going on with the tank. But so it's that. I also think for somebody starting off in the hobby that you got to do a lot of research. You got to do your homework. You got to pick up some books, read some books. Peruse the forums. I mean, not all the information you're gonna find on the forums is good information, but there is a lot of good information out there. But just be a sponge, soak in as much as you can in terms of trying to understand as much about this hobby as you can before you jump in. And I would always recommend starting off small. Maybe you get a smaller reef tank and maybe a nano tank or whatnot if you've never kept a fish tank, and get some rock in there, get some live rock in there, and maybe some fish, and do that for like a year or something like that, and kind of work your way up, and then start dabbling in some hardy LPS corals or what have you, and then eventually start getting into the hard coral stuff in the aquapore. But I think kind of, the mistake that I would see somebody making is trying to do things too quickly. So it's patience. It's really, I think that's the way you got to approach this hobby.
That's great advice. Okay, Keith, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Where can people listening to the podcast find out more about you and Reefbum? Yeah,
they can visit my website, reefbum.com, reefbum.com, and on there, you could also find my YouTube channel on there, and you could also find the book. I wrote a book about a year ago, so you can go check that out on the website, and there's a whole bunch of good information. I got a blog on the website, and a bunch of how-to articles to hopefully help hobbyists out there really navigate through the reef keeping world we have here. But yeah, thanks again, Jeff. I really appreciate you asking me to be a guest, and look forward to doing it again sometime again in the near future.
All right, folks, that was my interview with Keith Bruckelhammer of Reefbum. And if you want to go check him out, there's going to be links to everything that we talked about in today's episode on the show notes at saltwateraquarium.com/SAR030 for episode number 30. And I want to thank you guys for making it this far into the podcast. And if you did, you're awesome. That's going to do it for today. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll see you again right here with a brand new podcast.
You've been listening to the SAR Podcast. To find out more about today's topics featured on the show, as well as more episodes of the SAR Podcast, visit www.saltwateraquariumradio.com.